Tokenization. It's a weird word, and yet is one that continues to be repeated throughout the traditional financial services sector. What is it? Why do it? And how do we progress the space going forward? Welcome back to Crypto Clarified. I'm Benjamin Dean. I am Director for Digital Asset Strategy at Wisdom Tree. Today, to help me explore these concepts, I'm joined by Maredith Hannon, who's the Head of Business Development for Digital Assets at Wisdom Tree. As you know, this podcast, we help you explore the complex and evolving world of digital assets. And right now, there's a lot of focus on it. Before we start, though, US listeners, check out wisdomtreeprime.com, Apple, Android app stores, wherever you have your purveyor of podcasts. Hit subscribe and share, though. That's helpful. It helps you share good information with people who need good information. Check me out at Benjamin Dean on the Bird app, X. Check it out. Before we begin, of course, I know the best part of the show, James and Sam in compliance. This disclaimer is for you. Before I begin, I do need to state the following to clarify the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree and is subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied upon as forecast research nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities and reliance upon them. It's at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. We're going to the fun stuff. Maredith Hannon, here we go. Welcome to Crypto Clarified.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ben, for having me. I'm so excited to be here, BCD. It's always an honor. So thank you so much. BCD.
You know. Well, look, we're going to have a great show today, and we're going to talk about this word that has been bandied about quite a lot, which is tokenization. We're going to help the listeners think a little bit about what that actually means in practice, why one would want to do it compared to traditional system. And we're going to talk about some of the obstacles to the process playing out. So before we start, though, this is the first time you're on the show, so please tell the listeners a bit about you, how you got into this space, and why we have the pleasure of working with one another.
We do. We have a lot of fun too. If only people could hear what we were talking about with Willy Wonka before this, with our love of movies. So I'm Maredith Hannon. I lead business development for Wisdom Tree. I've been here over 2 years, which I cannot believe. I feel like so much has happened in this space, and yet we're still talking a lot about the same themes from an educational perspective. So it's been a lot of fun. But I came from Morgan Stanley, where I ran business development for their outsourced chief investment office, which is a super fancy way of saying we manage multi-asset class portfolios for some of the largest institutions, endowments, foundations, pensions, but also family offices. And through that experience, I got introduced to Bitcoin and Ether from an asset class perspective. And then previous to Morgan Stanley, I started my career at Merrill Lynch, where I got introduced to blockchain technology as really an opportunity to scale and make internal processing of whether it's bank transactions, sales transactions, contracts, just more efficient. So I saw blockchain from, and really tokenization from, both a business operational perspective and then also cryptocurrencies as an asset class. And I put those two ideas together and said, this is what I want to do for my career. So I found Wisdom Tree, and it's been a great journey so far. I do a lot in terms of partnerships. Obviously, this is why we work so well together and do so much together, but also whether it's protocols, partnerships, business types of relationships, and also distribution for some new exciting products that I'm not going to talk about today, but that we're working on and putting out into the market.
Well, it's nice to know that you survived and you made it all the way out of, well, you're in the TradFi world, but we know that the two are merging. So it's good that you survived, because
I did survive.
we get to work on some very interesting things. Now,
Yeah.
there is a word that's been floating around, and the listeners know already that I don't like the word tokenization, but
Hmm.
here we are. Um,
Yes.
Now, the CEO and founder of Wisdom Tree, Jonathan Steinberg, was on national television the other day, and the anchor was essentially asking, like, what does this mean? It's like it's a technical term. Um, what is tokenization?
Sure. So, if you think about tokenization, really at a fundamental level, what we're talking about here is representation, representing real world assets on chain, at least for what we're doing. But it's also tokenizing specific elements per se. So I think this is where there's and we're actually coming out with a blog soon about digitization versus tokenization, which I think is an important distinction too, because digitization, think about eBay, right? Think about you would take I'm looking at some, your cell phone or whether it's, um, a bottle of perfume and you want to digitize that, put it online, and then put it into some sort of marketplace like an eBay and sell it. That's a digitization of something that's in the real world, but then really you need to have it off chain, meaning like in some real life form for you to be able to
Mhm.
utilize it. eBay is not something where like then you can barter with your perfume and then buy an iPhone. You get two perfumes for an iPhone. That's not how that works from a digitization perspective. A tokenization perspective is really it making anything you tokenize a utility. And I think that's what really excites me is that these are tokens with a value attached that you're able to move across chain in different types of ways. So I think that's a key distinction here is that those terms are definitely confused, but also when we're talking about tokenization, we're talking about assets that are represented on chain and then they have a utility of them. And that's really what's new and different, and I think exciting about what this space is. What would
You
you
know,
say
it's
though? What would you add to that from a technological perspective?
like I like to call it buzzword bingo, which is like, yes, internet comes along. Yes, new way for people to exchange information, do commercial relationships, resilient system, so on and so forth, right? The kind of interesting wrinkle here, and I'm sure this will be covered in your blog, is that instead of it being on a series of isolated databases, where it's quite manual actually to have those databases reconcile, in this case, tokenization, they are distributed databases that
Hmm.
reconcile themselves in almost real time. And
Yes.
because it's open source software, Turing complete language put on top means programmability and global reach. Like that is different to the previous tech stack, really. But it's a great differentiating, well, way in which to explain the differentiation between the two systems and points us towards the future. Now, I've just alluded a little bit to it, but why would somebody want to use this new or different tech stack, which is tokenization versus digitizing things in
Hmm.
segregated databases?
Yeah, and something else I should have noted too was there's also an element of rights and ownership that is also really new and different here, where truly owning the tokens means that you are entitled to whether it's a title, whether it's to an actual underlying asset, or whether to it's the actual cryptocurrency at the end of the day, and there's an ownership to that, which I think is important. But why this is so exciting and why people are excited about this is because to your point about the start of the internet, there's all these different databases, and you think about it from a business perspective, that how would you communicate with another business? You would probably do it
Yes.
in batches overnight, maybe once a day. Think about even just computer power, think about the size of these files. This is going back, and it's not too long ago. I'm talking about, 5 years ago, banks are still faxing, and that is the only way that you can provide information. You have to send a fax. They will only receive a fax. So think about that even from a operational perspective. You need to have someone, first of all, who knows how to use a fax machine. Second of all, manning the other fax machine to pick up said fax and to be able, or via email, to be able to process orders or to get client information or requests together or to set up a trust as an example. So what this technology really does is, I think to your point about real time is very important, but also about truly making this a permanent source of record. And I think that's so important. Even just think of the idea of version
Yeah.
control, right? Version control is something that's so big too, that I think is a problem that people underestimate, where this really ensures that this was the timestamp, this was the data that was processed, this is the transaction that happened. There's no edit in an Excel spreadsheet. There's no, control Z and you lose half of whatever yesterday was. It is the finality of that, I think, is very important too. And I know we're laughing and I'm saying these things, but these are real examples of things that can happen in the real world that with the finality
Absolutely.
of blockchain, that's not happening. And it is a source of truth. And I think that's something that whether you're an accountant, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're someone like us in an asset manager type of business, or whether you're even a portfolio manager that's managing a significant amount of portfolios, knowing what the source of truth is, I think is actually very important. I also get really excited about music royalties and what that could mean, but that's a whole nother side that we can
That
talk
is
about. But I
what.
know we'll keep it on finance. But I think there's just a lot of applications here that give the power to the writer, and meaning who is actually interacting on chain, and then also just from a accessibility perspective, being able to share that information with multiple counterparties and knowing that there's one golden standard of truth is something that is really, really innovative, and that it can be done in a public, permissionless way, I think is really exciting.
Yeah. The listeners already know public key cryptography. You have private keys. Nobody can steal them unless they have computing power for 10 million years or something, right? So that's the idea of ownership. That
Hmm.
is, say, control. Um, now, you said, oh, let's not go too deep. No, we're going straight down the rabbit hole. Technology
Okay.
history time, listeners. Everybody knows. Nobody loves technology history more than Benjamin C. Dean. So, Meredith, uh, telex or Minitel, are you familiar with either of those concepts?
No, talk
Ah,
to me.
all right.
Educate me.
Telex.
This is why I come on this show. I'm going to learn something. This is great. Son of,
Uh,
the sun god of Ra, and then we can cover technology
Egyptian
history.
hieroglyphs and
Yeah.
Parsi. Now, so to make it short for listeners, there are technology step changes in time. Telegraph goes to telex. Telex was a system to communicate between different terminals. It was used in Chile in the 1970s. You already know that story, listeners. Cyber sin is what it's called. Um, Minitel was essentially a proto internet built in France. And the issue with Minitel, it took off in France, but because the system wasn't open, that is to say anyone could access it, and so not interoperable, Minitel died. TCP IP won out as the protocol. Now, I get the feeling that there's something going on at the moment, which is a step change in terms of interoperable ways in which people can exchange information, as you say correctly, like a definitive record of what occurred, timestamped, right? How do you think about a financial system or set of financial systems that interact with one another? And I ask that in the context of this tokenization, which
Hmm.
is a way in which people can transact with different assets in a way that they couldn't do before. I'm interested in your
Yes.
thoughts because you're
Yes.
so close
Yes.
to the matter.
And I think that is it is the network effect that I think is really powerful here. So I alluded to this at when I was just saying about counterparties and having access to this information, but it's really about this
Mhm.
network effect. So think of this just from a traditional finance perspective. We would need to, and this is something that we do today, we would have individual agreements with all of the different providers that we have. Versus if you
Okay.
go on chain and there's some sort of dapper marketplace, then again, kind of flipping the script where we need to go to everyone. Now everyone can come to us. So think about that from the end user perspective. It's actually accessibility. And it's also an ability to have access to so many more options, both from an investment perspective, but also from a fractional share perspective. And being able to do it through smart contracts atomically. And we've done some proofs of concepts that alluded to this. So from a technology perspective, we can do it. It's if the lawyers and the regulators will let us get there, but I'm sure we'll get to that, which is
Right.
okay. This is part of the process. But
Absolutely.
really from a technology perspective, I think that's what's so interesting about this is building that network and that community, and where we as consumers had to go to individual places in the past from a finance perspective. Like I have probably 4 or 5 banks, for and why it's different parts of my life, different needs. I've got a mortgage, whatever else it is, checking accounts, savings accounts, brokerage. And now to
Yeah.
be able to say, I can go to one place and access all of these assets. And this is again future down the road, but be able to do that in one ecosystem. I think that's what's really exciting. I think it's
Okay.
also definitely flipping the script for traditional finance firms where they're used to people coming to them, and now they very much more need to build into this new ecosystem and have their consumers come to them in a different way. But I think at the end of the day, it makes it so that assets are more readily available, meaning underlying, whether it's equities, fixed income, alternatives is a big one that's talked about. But the accessibility of those products, I think, is going to be improved through this technology. The utility of them, and I mentioned that before, being able to spend off of a money market fund or gold or some other asset, which you can't really do today in an efficient way. And then also fractionalized shares of it, where, today so many investment products, or not so many, but there's an aspect of finance that is only for the ultra wealthy, the institutional types of players, because the minimums
Mhm.
are so high, because you need to be an accredited investor, what have you. And I think with this technology, you can start to see the fractionalization of that, where through pooling and really bringing investors together, then they would be able to access new opportunities and down the line higher yields than what they had before. So that's very much the dream. Where we are today, it's very much more focused on the ability to peer transfer, which is really, really cool and different. Like think about, instead of giving your friend a gift card for their birthday, you can give them, an S&P 500 share or something like that, or, a fund share. And then also just in terms of what, again, the accessibility looks like and the fact you can do all of this on your phone, I think is really cool and interesting. And I think the utility aspect is going to come into play.
Okay. Now, like, it's been obvious for a while, right? Like the technology is there.
Yeah.
Now, listeners are probably asking themselves, well, that's, technology, that's all very nice and, nice pipe dream. Um, now, th there are tokenized assets out there now. Could you give the listeners a little bit of an idea about um, which assets, how much it's grown, and what your view is on where it could go?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I think the obvious ones are stable coins, right? I think those are really seen
Yeah.
broadly in the market. And that's really, I'm probably, you've covered this 5 times, but stable coins, think of them similar to currency like a US dollar, and a lot of them are backed. But I will say that stable coins, and maybe this could be a whole nother show, not all stable coins are created equal. There's
Yep.
very different ways to create a stable coin. So I don't want to say buyer
Yep.
beware necessarily, but at least buyer do your homework. And then there's
Listeners, go back.
traditional.
Sorry, Meredith. Listeners, go back to the episode with Austin Campbell for the differences
Yes,
between stablecoins and their nuances, because we've covered it before. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but like,
no, it's really
it's been
important
covered
though.
before.
Really, it's
Absolutely.
very important, and I think that's something, especially over the last 2 years, you've seen, whether it's depeggings or whether it's just understanding who is controlling the keys, literally and figuratively. All of that is very important. So
Absolutely.
that's one aspect, right? Stable coins. Then there's the assets perspective from equities, fixed income, so much more traditional asset classes, and this is where we've seen even since April, a massive spike in tokenized treasuries on chain, which
Okay.
I think is really exciting and truly shows a need for yield on chain, where as DeFi yields have been decreasing, there's definitely an opportunity for treasuries, US treasuries specifically, to come on chain.
So how big is it now? Like in terms of
I
spike,
think it's what we
how
can
much
give.
volume?
Hopefully we can put up a little graphic or something here when we do this, but I think it's up to 1.2 billion. I can check it out.
Yeah.
RWA XYZ is great resources for that. But it's really, really large. Also, private credit has also increased significantly too. And so some of these figures are astounding in the billions. But of course, when you think about the total market of $30 trillion in finance, it's definitely a percentage point. But if you then start to chart that compared to, like we like to compare it to the growth of the ETF market, it's going to be like a hockey stick where it grows slowly over time and then it's going to seriously increase. So I think that's also adoption on chain, of course, but we're seeing more and more. And I think that's because of not only from a yield perspective, but also from just an adoption perspective of truly crypto natives, but then also other types of platforms coming online where you might not even know that you're holding a token. You're
Okay.
using your phone, and that means that the technology is working the way that it should. It shouldn't be obvious in your face, I don't think, especially for most of the population. It is really complicated to set up. I think about my parents and having them manage their own keys, and that's I don't think going to happen ever, and that's okay. There's good to have other options to be able to still access these exposures.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, listeners, you know cybersecurity for 10 years, people managing their own private keys. We already saw what CrowdStrike did, which is a different problem. That's software,
Yes.
automatic software pushes that take down the internet in place. It's hard, it's
Yes. And
complicated,
centralized.
technical.
Centralized, right? I mean, that was also
Yeah.
a great example of how centralized infrastructure when things go wrong.
It's somewhat ironic because the internet was meant to be a distributed system that would ensure, in the event of a first nuclear strike, that people could communicate with one another. And as it's evolved, centralization has occurred to that point.
Mhm.
Anyway, rabbit hole. Um, let's talk
But
a
it's
little
a
bit
good one. I
about.
think that's such a good one because blockchain goes back to those basics of decentralization
uh,
in such an interesting way. 20 years, what year is it? 25, 30 years later, it's still that pull back to decentralization. It's the same theme. Talk about history repeating itself. It's the same theme of, okay, as things have become so centralized, how do we pull away and create more decentralized types of opportunities?
I met somebody about 8 years ago. This is when I was a fellow for cybersecurity, and Andrew McLaughlin is his name. Listeners, you can look it up. Um, he was one of the people who had built the somewhat early internet companies. Again, go look it up. Andrew
We need
said
like
to
a
me, he goes, "Look,
VH1 pop-up video. Do you remember that VH1 pop-up video where it has the bubbles? We need that for these. But keep going. Idea for next time.
but Andrew's idea, and that he explained to me, was that essentially the technology, it's digital technology, swings between two poles. One is centralization, the other is decentralization.
Yeah.
And as it swings to one direction, eventually the countervailing force occurs and it swings back. This is a little bit like the idea, again, technology history, um, mainframes. Um, IBM mainframes in like the 1970s, right? They are centralized computing systems. Then eventually what happened is people could create their own server at home if they wanted, distributed system. Then it swings back to the cloud, right? And the momentum is swinging back again towards distributed systems, distributed databases, open source software, public key. Anyway, everyone knows. Um, that technology dynamic, if one can track it, one can identify opportunities, avoid risks, achieve nice life. And yeah, we don't have to laugh about MTV pop-ups and stuff anymore. I have a story about
Oh,
pop-ups
we
as
could.
well, but we won't.
Okay, we'll save that for later.
Now, now, let's talk a little bit then. I was going to talk about our friends in Argentina, but
Oh yeah. Okay.
no, let's do that. So
Okay.
tokenization of assets, it's a few $1 billion now. It's mostly, as you say, stable coins. It's mostly T-bills, some money market funds, fine. Um, our friends in Argentina at AgroToken, um, tokenizing commodities. Do you want
Yes.
to
And truly
do you want to
commodities.
tell the story?
I it's well, you're I feel like you're a better storyteller than me, but I am so
Boring.
excited about what they're doing. Just even from a truly, I mean, when we talk about commodities, when we talk about commodities, we're talking about gold, oil, copper, silver. When they're talking about commodities, they're talking about soybeans, wheat. I mean, this is really, really interesting, the connection between farming to finance. It's fascinating, but please go ahead.
But why? Remember, maybe you tell me. Do you remember why it was soybeans and now they've moved into other commodities? Why was it specifically that that was interesting and a business opportunity? And
It was
this is
related to
just an
the to
example of. Go ahead.
it
Sorry.
was related to payments, right? For the farmers to
Yes.
be able to
Yes.
access because the what was it? The soybeans were in silos and they wouldn't get paid until the
Yes.
soybeans were paid out. So instead of doing that,
Correct.
they pretty much prepaid the farmers so that and put a value to the soybeans in the silos so then they could get the money today and not have to wait 5 years, right? It was something along those lines.
Yeah, and they would use distributed ledgers to essentially reconcile and ensure that people could trust one another in what is a relatively low trust society. That anyway, I'm bringing that up because it. Whenever people come to me and they say, "Oh, who uses blockchain for anything?" Like, what is a blockchain? I go, "Listen, what you've said actually. It's an immutable database that allows people to interact with one another using public key cryptography in a way that's provable as a record. And because it's new technology, but it can be layered on to the way in which people interact already. Farmers in Argentina settle essentially via barter using soybeans in this case. But just using new technology to solve old problems essentially is kind of
Yes.
why tokenization. And
Mm-hmm.
once you kind of get your head around that, not you specifically, but like you
People.
stop going and saying, "Oh, Ether, what's Ether used for?" You go, "Well, it's used to pay for transactions on the Ethereum network that allow people to have
Mm-hmm.
economic interactions with one another." And then suddenly it starts to make
Exactly.
sense, right?
Yes. Insert problem statement here. And that problem is solving, really, that problem is solving for global transactions in real time that are finite and also based on a set of fixed rules, right? That's essentially what a smart contract is that once a set of rules are met, then there you are, the transactions executed on. I would add too with our friends at AgroToken from a soybean perspective. What I also found fascinating is that this is an existing problem. So going back to my point on utility, this is taking
Yes.
true utility where there is a problem of farmers need to be paid today. They do not want to wait 5 years. How do we provide liquidity to them today? How do we make soybeans a utility via a Visa card? Blockchain, tokenization, the tokenization of their farmland, the production of the farmland, and then being able to deliver that in fiat through existing rails. I mean, that's a true combination of taking a real world problem, adding utility to something that doesn't have the same utility today, or liquidity, or timeline that they're dealing with, and then making it real time, providing the utility through a token, and being able to improve people's lives. Which is pretty cool. Pretty cool example.
Listeners, you can go back to the episode we recorded with Gabriel Gruber, who's also in Argentina, and not
Yes.
coincidentally is solving problems that he and people around him face in Latin America via the same set of technologies or
Yes.
certain permutations of it. But you can go back, Gabriel Gruber, check it out. All
Worth
right.
it. That is so worth it. That is, besides music royalties, I think they are one of the coolest. examples of truly showing utility and solving a problem. Very cool.
Very entrepreneurial, very innovative, creative. Uh, Now, let's then turn to the difficulties
Mm.
because, again, listeners are probably sitting there and saying, oh, well, that sounds all very nice, pipe dream people. Like, what are the practical difficulties in terms of bringing this? Because
Yep.
I've been so far down the rabbit hole for so long, and I've met so many people in all the places I've lived. Like it's obvious to me, but you also have met lots of people, and you've seen obstacles. What are the practical obstacles in terms of people
Yes.
just using technology to solve their
Hmm.
problems in this case?
I think it's two main ones. So it's,
Okay,
and we alluded to this before, really legal regulatory, and I'll get to that first. But then also the second is really around adoption, and that's, people throw that term around, but that means a lot of different things. So I'll dive into that. But from a legal regulatory perspective, like we were just saying, it's global infrastructure, it's decentralized, anyone can build on it, anyone can write on it. But when you're dealing with legal structures of financial services products, nothing is global. So the question is, from a jurisdictional
mm,
perspective, all of the laws and regulations are still routed in these off-chain types of structures, just because that's the way the financial system today is. Now, there's a lot of
mhm,
legislation out there that's really, really promising, from whether it's MICA to the Swiss DLT regulations to France is doing some e-money licenses that are really exciting. Here in the US, there's a few bills that are being put out. So there's a lot of progress, definitely down in Latin America. Brazil is definitely a leader down there too. Argentina
yes,
with some use cases as well. So across, I'm remiss in
Singapore.
not mentioning Singapore. Yep, I was just going to say that. Singapore is also definitely ahead of the game too. Same mind share as we travel around the globe. So I think there's a lot of promise there, but it is something that is a hurdle, because today someone in Singapore can't necessarily easily buy something on the New York Stock Exchange. They can through a lot of different hoops and rigor, but it's not as easy as doing it necessarily on your phone, without a lot of, whether it's accounts and then also KYC and all of that. So I do think, meaning know your customer, which is a big legal and financial piece of as you onboard clients, that's very important. So
Okay,
I think that there are aspects of the legal and the regulatory landscape that need to be figured out. And I think that does lead to the second piece, which is adoption. So if you can't put all the products that you want to out there into the market, obviously there's an adoption issue. But there's also an adoption issue because of, like we were talking about, holding your own keys, having your own wallet. But even more than that, it's marketplaces. It's, where do you buy these products? How are you getting access to them? And then how is that better, truly better? And this is something that I know you and I talk about a lot. How is this truly better and different than what you can get today? And I think that's the utility angle that we were talking about, and solving a problem that, at least we really try to focus on. And that's something that I'm personally really passionate about, is how is this solving a problem for you in your day-to-day life? And I do think this technology can do a lot of that. If anyone's like me, I am, in the day of the internet, I'm an impatient person. If I put in a transaction, I want to be settled right then, right now. And I can't wait. And that's really what this is able to solve. So I think it's those two elements that are really, we're grappling with. I think we'll get there on both sides, but I think it's going to be something that brings people on chain in a way that they don't even know that they're on chain, that I think is really going to be a differentiator. Because if you start to do, like you said before, with cybersecurity, managing your own private keys, I mean, it's a lot of work, and you do need to be very astute in this technology, versus if you're using your phone, or if you're using a web page or something that you're familiar with, and the technology is running on the back end. I think that could be a potential win for sure.
okay. Now, Meredith, I have to correct you for a slight point there. You said you're
Yes.
impatient. No, no, no. You're
Yes.
very patient. You have to work with me. Like,
I try. I should say I
no,
am
no,
I'm patient with people, not with technology. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
it's a
Very.
slight correction, but
I'll have it.
uh, usability. Here's an interesting dynamic, and maybe we share some thoughts on this. I know we're coming up on time, but I always like to hear what you think about these kinds of things. So, um, the premise that you just laid out is need regulatory, legal kind of framework structure.
Clarity, structure. Yep.
At the same time, like adoption, which is people
Mm.
using technology because it solves a problem for them. Now, I know plenty of people who just use the technology. It's a bit tricky, right? But they learn how to do it and then solves problem. They send money from one they send money, which is register entry on distributed database, from one country to other country in inverted commas. So person to person, private key to private key. Well, it's public private, but whatever. Um, they're already doing it. Now, I ran some numbers the other week, which was, how many people in the United States of America currently own or use crypto in inverted commas. And the Federal Reserve did a survey a couple of years ago. They said it's between 8 to 11%. Um, that would place the numbers somewhere between 20 to 30 million Americans already doing it, right?
Hmm.
Just to press a bit harder on this idea that one needs regulatory clarity in
Yeah.
order to foster technological adoption. People are already doing it. They've
Oh,
been doing it
absolutely.
for over a decade, right?
Yes.
Why would you want, and I'm here, FTX, why would you want legal and regulatory clarity around companies that provide services that help
Hmm.
people solve problems in their lives of the nature that we just described?
Hmm. I think it's, well, and to your point about some of the events of June 2022, which, if you follow when I started Wisdom Tree, I think I was here a whopping 3 weeks, and the crypto universe melted. So that was a fun moment in time.
Baptism by
Um,
fire.
yes, exactly. But I think it's a really, really good example of why all of this regulation was put in place. And if you look back, there's actually a great really summary of this. I can't recall which podcast it was on though. When FTX, the meltdown happened, was someone came on speaking about the 40 Act. But 1940 Act is a famous regulation in the U.S. Or not famous, but it's a big legal regulation in the U.S. And why that was put in place in the 1920s and the 30s was because of the same types of activities that FTX was doing today. So this is a great
Mm-hmm.
bridge of talk about history repeating itself. It's the same sort of nonsense that was going on back then is similar nonsense that what's
Yep.
going on today. And that's why these regulations are in play. And that's around the world, right? There's bad actors and therefore regulation is passed to protect retail investors. So I do think that structure is important. And I think that's also where from a regulation perspective, as you start to think about, we said look up for stable coins, the underlying structure of them, understand what you're owning. And I think that's something that every investor should know. But just understanding what it is and who you're getting into business with essentially is a great business practice. And especially for legal and regulation in this space where it is new, it's definitely burgeoning. There's definitely opportunities on both ends of the spectrum. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated one.
it
History
is.
repeating. Absolutely. New technology comes along. Uh, if people don't understand it, then lack of transparency creates problems bad.
Yes.
It's really important to make sure that everything
Any
is
black
very
box.
clear.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Anyway,
Yes.
we're at time, Meredith. We finish episodes by thinking about the future, and you're someone with your ear very close to the ground in terms of what is happening in this kind of changing financial services industry globally. What do you think listeners should keep their eye on, or what are you interested in at the moment?
Sure. So I think definitely there's going to be a lot in terms of this convergence of TradFi coming on chain. I definitely think that's something to watch. And what I mean by that is not so much that it's going to be in your face. I think that you are just going to start to hear about projects where, okay, this part was put on chain. If you think about even from a supply chain perspective, there's a few really, really big box Fortune 500 companies that all of their operations from a supply chain perspective are on chain now. And you wouldn't know. Just your UPS package is
Yeah.
getting to you a little bit faster than it used to. That's a great example of how this technology can be used. So definitely look for stories like that you can start to see the effects of it. That again, solving a problem utilizing the technology without it necessarily being in your face. But I think personally, and this is something that we've talked a lot about, you and I, Ben, is identity. I think that's something that is going to
Mhm.
definitely be figured out over the next, I'd say, 18 months to 2 years. And that means on-chain identity. I think that's something that is really going to be interesting to see how that gets worked out. I'm not sure yet where it'll go, but I think that's interesting. And I think also just truly the democratization of finance. I know that's something that's kind of a buzzword that's thrown out there, but I think about truly the accessibility of being able to provide new solutions to new customer segments utilizing this technology in a way that it's easier for them to consume, I think is super, super exciting. It's what's near and dear to my heart. So I'm excited to see that dream continue to be fleshed out. But it's definitely still in the early innings here. As the baseball fans would say, I go to one Yankee game last week, and now I'm making baseball references. But I think those are my three things that I would really, really focus on from a listener perspective.
Nice one. Well, Meredith, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
And a pleasure
You'll
too.
have to come back and talk
Yeah.
about the sun god Ra or something esoteric or
Or
something
Willy Wonka.
practical
Yep. Yep. Okay. We can do
or
both.
Willy
Yes. We can do
Wonka.
more
That's it.
history repeating itself. I like this
More,
as a theme, as
more
a theme.
technology
Wait, do we have
history.
time? Do we have time for you to say what you're excited about? Can we do that in one piece?
Uh,
I think people want to hear
yes,
from you.
uh, they hear enough from me, but I'll indulge. Um,
Thank you.
and maybe we've already covered this, but you just mentioned the kind of digital identity thing, which is one that does occupy my mind. I have an Estonian, what do they call it, like an e-visa or something. It's a card with a chip where when you want to do transactions or like you have company in Estonia need to authorize consent to essentially make transaction and I am me and here's my public private key pair and like do it. The Estonians designed that after the Cold War ended. They told me, at least, this is, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. They said, look, we were on a shoestring budget, so we had to put something together, but we had good technical people. So they essentially created an early version of a blockchain, distributed database, open source software, public private key in order to authenticate entries onto distributed database. That most people would know about it, and so I won't belabor the point, but that kind of thing has been playing out at a broader and broader scale, not on their model, but similar technical conception. So there's a reason I spend so much time looking at this and thinking about this. The space is not finite, it is not fixed. And so we could go on and on, maybe when we get you on next episode, but it's important, I think, for listeners to remember, and I've talked about Telex and Minitel, and we've talked about TCP/IP, and we could talk about email protocols and things. It keeps rolling forward, fortunately, but it's not a straight line, right?
No.
And so that keeps me busy in the late hours of the evening when I'm doing what I'm
Thinking
doing.
about these
But anyway,
things.
we have to call it a day, Meredith. But you'll be back soon, and I'm looking forward to it.
Be back soon. Yes, and please find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, all of that good stuff. And my name.
Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, so Maredith, so it's spelled a little bit differently, but think of the vowels AEIOU, Maredith. And on LinkedIn, Twitter, anywhere else, you'll see probably me and Ben laughing about some old movie on Twitter and stuff, and him actually doing work stuff. So yeah, find me there, and I look forward to coming back. That would be really fun. Thanks again for having me.
Excellent. Until next time.
Bye.
Later. Well, there you go. Meredith Hannon, one of my esteemed colleagues at Wisdom Tree. US listeners, wisdomtreeprime.com. Check it out. Apple, Android app stores. Find me on the Bird app. I'm on it too much. You can find me there, X at Benjamin Dean. It's always nice having you here. Always nice sharing information. And I look forward to seeing